Good evening, everybody, and congratulations to the new team who has just taken over. And Nikunj and Manish sir told me that your presentation hai, first meeting and you have to present one of the cases. So initially I told Nikunj कि मैं ये करने वाला हूँ, I'll do it for Mals. So the first thing he told me, यार तुम ये presentation सर्जिकल presentation है, ये क्या कर रहे हो तुम? तो फिर मैंने मनीष सर को बोला कि नहीं सर माल्स पे करने वाला हूँ. तो सर थोड़े से ओल्ड टाइमर है, तो सर ने बोला अरे यार तू ये क्या गोलमाल वगैरह कर रहा है. तो मैंने नहीं सर, दिस इज माल्स. So coming back to this, so this is median arcuate ligament syndrome, celiac artery compression syndrome. Many names for it because historically this has been a difficult topic to understand. बहुत सारे लोग अभी तक ये ऐसा कुछ होता है ऐसा मानते भी नहीं है. So there is always so it is similar to SMA syndrome कि बहुत सारी चीजें proven है, बहुत सारी चीजें non proven है. So if we see the anatomical basis for this, so median arcuate ligament is a tough fibrous arch connecting the right and the left crura of the diaphragm at the level of the aortic hiatus. So जहाँ पर aorta abdomen में enter करता है, वहाँ पर this crosses the aorta just above the celiac axis. And the beauty of this is, if you know, we all have seen cadavers जब dissection करते हैं और जो कुछ भी उस समय सीखा और देखा. So this appears to be a static structure, but actually in a living person, when the person is inspiring and expiring, there is almost a 2 to 2.5 centimeters movement of this median arcuate ligament syndrome. So it is one of the things which moves with the diaphragm. And that is one of the important reasons why in some patients it causes symptoms and why in others it doesn't cause a symptom. So if we see the anatomy, so this is the aortic hiatus. It's just coming inside the abdomen. This is the esophageal hiatus. So when we are doing a hiatus hernia surgery, we deal with this area, and this is the area where the problem is. So this is the aortic hiatus and this is the esophageal hiatus. So Mal's anatomy is that you have a normal patient will have an anatomy something like this, while in a patient who has a low-lying median arcuate ligament, this will compress the celiac. So celiac axis वैसे भी बहुत छोटी सी होती है. Actually, and many times it is less than 1 centimeters. So this arcuate ligament compresses this in this area. Or in inspiration and expiration में when this movement is there, so this goes up, बीच में थोड़ा सा relief मिलता है. When it comes down, again the patient can experience some ischemic problems. That is a problem for this. Sorry. So the pathophysiology is poorly understood. There are variable presentations and severity. Some patients may have a very prominent median arcuate ligament syndrome on the CT scan, but they may have no symptoms at all. So it is actually very difficult to decide which patient you need to operate and which not, because at times even after surgery the patient's pain may not go. So it's a bit tricky. So the pathophysiology basically comprises of 4 to 5 things. That there is some vascular compression that has been, now this is proven beyond doubt. There is also a theory that there are some ganglionic nerves around this area which causes pressure on the celiac axis. These patients have excessive smooth muscle proliferation which probably causes some obstruction at the origin. There is blood flow turbulence. So whenever there is an obstruction at the celiac axis, there is turbulence in the blood flow, similar to the BP curve जो हम बांधते हैं, carotid curve sounds सुनते हैं, उसी तरीके का turbulence अंदर create होता है, which causes problems. Significantly, there is a post-stenotic dilatation. Usually, these people will have an obstruction, and then the celiac axis will bulge out. So that is the post-stenotic. So that is because of this turbulence, and there is a strong association with aneurysms. Almost 30% of these patients will have some aneurysm somewhere else in the body. Maybe hepatic artery, maybe supramesenteric artery. So again, during expiration, there is compression of the celiac axis by the median arcuate ligament syndrome. The diaphragm moves upwards, causing stretching of the crura. which causes overcompression. So to understand this, this is another diagram. These are your sympathetic chains, which again may cause obstruction of the origin. And a rough diagram is this. So this is the median arcuate ligament syndrome arising from this vertebrae column and going to the other side. और ये celiac, ये aorta है और ये celiac axis है. यहाँ पर वो obstruction cause करता है. Again to make this understand, normal patients में ऐसा मिलता है. Mass patients में this can be like this. The anatomy, there is just a 1 to 2 centimeters variation, but it causes these symptoms. So approximately 2 per 1 lakh population, males to female ratio is females are more commonly affected. Usually the 20 to 50 year age bracket. Radiological compression can be present in patients. Routine CT scans can have almost 25% of patients may have compression reported, but most of these will have no symptoms. So इसलिए decision to operate and not to operate is very important. Now presentation is postprandial pain. This is the classical symptom. Patient will have a severe postprandial pain, which usually is because of ischemia after your food. So it is similar to mesenteric ischemia. It is still a diagnosis of exclusion. Before labeling any patient, you have to do the complete workup, a sonography, a CT scan, a GI endoscopy, and even a psychiatric assessment. Because usually it is females and that age bracket. So you will end up with a psychiatric patient who you have operated and still she has symptoms. And radiological imaging is there to help you. So routine investigations, Doppler study. This is a very promising study. So ultrasound people, if they are told that you have to see this, they will see this. So turbulence in the blood flow during expiration, inspiration can give a very strong indication that this is a median arcuate ligament syndrome. Because वहाँ पर they can see. और thankfully, ये patients because of this pain they have lost a lot of weight also. So usually they are thin built, people who don't have much fat. So sonography people are able to see this much more clearly. CT abdomen is the most definitive investigation which will tell us the anatomy. There are some tests which used to be done. They are not very significant nowadays with good quality CT scans. But there was a thing which celiac block. People used to give a celiac block before surgery to decide which patient is going to behave well after surgery. So somebody who responds good to celiac block is a good surgical candidate. And angiography. So many enthusiastic cardiologists and intervention people have tried even stenting and all these things. So they do angiography, conventional angiography to. So CT scan is what is important for us as surgeons. So compression at the origin, post-aortic dilatation, other visceral aneurysms हैं या नहीं वो rule out करने के लिए, और कभी-कभी retrograde hepatic artery perfusion भी finding मिलती है इसमें कि the main celiac axis is blocked, so the hepatic artery is filling from the SMA, so there is a retrograde filling. The treatment is you have to select the patient very diligently, and then lysis of the median arcuate ligament and associated ganglionic tissue. This is the most important thing. Complete lysis has to be done. At least 4 centimeters of celiac axis origin with the aorta. 3 to 4 centimeters आपको दिखना चाहिए सर्जरी के बाद naked. ऊपर का टिश्यू सब डिवाइड हो जाना चाहिए. There are some things which is reimplantation of celiac axis. Usually vascular people do these things. Usually they are not required, but अगर किसी को बहुत long standing celiac axis obstruction है, तो there is fibrosis of the vessel, and ऐसे patients में फिर reimplantation करने की जरूरत पड़ सकती है. People have even tried vascular grafts, iliac and aortic. We have also done this in one patient. I'll just come to that. So this is again a diagrammatic representation. This is the median arcuate ligament syndrome. इसको आपको divide करना पड़ता है. And even grafting has been, this is reimplantation, interposition grafts. This is all to improve the circulation. So the ischemia part is taken care of. So initially this was the turf of vascular surgeons, then conventional laparotomy was done for this. Now with the advent of minimal access surgeries, both laparoscopic and robotic surgeries, this is again gaining a lot of power, like fundoplication. So because the anatomy sunne mein might appear to be very dangerous and difficult, but surgically it's not a very difficult procedure. I mean, any surgeon with good amount of training should be able to do this. So the surgical plan is that this is the area that we have to bear. So this the median arcuate ligament हमें किसी तरीके से इसको पूरा साफ कर देना है जिससे इसका obstruction clear हो जाए. So the celiac axis is approached from there are two approaches mainly, that is one from the anterior, that is lesser curve के ऊपर से stomach के आगे से, और दूसरा है कि आप completely stomach को mobilize करें, stomach को retrogastrocolic ligament divide करें और पीछे से जाके stomach को lift करें और वहाँ से celiac axis को deal करें. So this is much easier for somebody like me who is just a beginner in his surgery. Other procedures can be celiac artery bypass and difficult procedures. You know, these probably would be of historical importance, and not much people would be doing all these things. Even balloon angioplasty. So ये सब भी कई लोगों ने try किया हुआ है. So I'll just go through some videos. So I have been fortunate to get 4 patients of median arcuate ligament syndrome, and out of these, one was a male patient, and the rest were female patients. So first, I'll just run through some CT images, and so these are all of some different patients. So what you can see here is this is the celiac axis. This is the celiac axis. This is the aorta. These are the celiac axis. I hope you can appreciate there is some compression on this segment. Again, a different view. This is the celiac axis, and there is a post-stenotic dilatation. This is the SMA. So this is good, and there is this thing. So again, we have to be very careful, because at times you can deal with a situation like this with a lot of plaques, atheromatous plaques. So patient को ऐसे भी mesenteric ischemia हो रहा है, और उसके साथ साथ patient को ये भी है, तो आपको बहुत सोच समझ के ये decide करना है कि कौन से symptoms आप relieve कर पाएंगे और कौन से relieve नहीं कर पाएंगे शायद. This is again a compression here with some post-stenotic dilatation. Now this is very marked. इसमें पूरा का पूरा celiac axis divided, compressed है. So these are the films with these pictures. You can see this compression here. So I don't have full-length videos of these patients which I have operated, but I do have some. So this was one. So I hope you can see this. So what my malleol end is going inside, and this is the median arcuate ligament. What I have dissected is the celiac axis. This is the celiac axis, and so we have to find the arteries. Follow one artery, whatever you feel best is, either the left gastric or the hepatic, and then go and dissect this area. So this, what is being hooked, is the median arcuate ligament. So this is causing severe compression over this area. This, you can see this is the post-stenotic dilatation, and the end result is something like so. This is the area which has been bared. This is the celiac axis, this is the aorta, and this is the celiac axis which is arising from here. This is the celiac axis. This has been cut. This, you can see this V. So this is the so again, this is a impinging is, this is the aorta and this is the median arcuate ligament. Median arcuate ligament. So you have to, in different angles, you have to clear this around 4 centimeters. So this is the area which has been bared. So we have divided this, and now, so usually this is how this is done. You hook the harmonic or ligashore, and taking care that the inactive blade has to be on the aortic side, and then this is divided. And as well, whenever you are going to divide this, the important thing is that this carries, the whole thing will come back with a bang because it is under pressure. So एकदम से वो ऊपर आता है. So these are some other. This is another patient. This is what you can see that we are trying to dissect the celiac axis, trying to remove the sympathetic ganglion chains and the smooth muscles over this area, and finally you will end up with the. So we had one patient who had a hiatus hernia, significant hiatus hernia with a median arcuate ligament syndrome. So both things can be done together. So this is the median arcuate ligament which is being hooked, and this is it. And now we have divided this. And now you can see this. This is the divided portion. So this median arcuate जो है यहाँ पर आपने उसको divide कर दिया. So the and what you can see up is the hiatus hernia यहाँ पर. So that is the esophagus, that is the hiatus hernia, and this is the area. So here you can see the celiac axis which is completely devoid of all the coverings. This is the left splenic artery going here. This is the left gastric. This is the hepatic artery, and this is the celiac axis. Again this. So in 4 patients, the main patient needed a vascular graft, while the rest of the 3 patients you were able to divide this, and most of them had good symptom relief. So that's it. This is the last video. So the celiac axis has been divided and the fundoplication is being done. Fluoroplasty is being done.
Coming to the topic, esophagectomy is undoubtedly a major surgical procedure in oncology. On one hand, it offers a significant advantage to the patient in terms of relief from dysphagia as well as controlling the disease process and potential for offering a chance of cure. On the other hand, it carries a potential for significant morbidity and complications, especially the pulmonary complication. And this highlights the importance of understanding the surgical and radiological anatomy before we decide the management of a patient presenting with esophageal cancer. Technical and cognitive abilities. The cognitive skill sets mostly focus on understanding the disease process and taking into account the patient's general condition, their preferences, the endoscopic and radiological finding of the disease, and as well as the response to any neoadjuvant treatment like chemotherapy or chemoradiation into consideration, and then bringing everything together and coming out with a cohesive management plan for the patient. On the other hand, the technical skill sets are mostly related to hands-on surgery, hands-on execution for surgery, understanding the minimal invasive surgical procedure, attention to the ergonomics and effective use of the non-dominant hand. So this is very important. I remember, probably Vishal sir will remember, that we used to have a cleft lip and cleft palate workshop in MI hospital once in 3 or 6 months. So Dr. Prakash Chandranani sir, he is a renowned plastic surgeon. He used to say that it is important to start using the non-dominant hand in day-to-day practice, like small things like brushing your teeth, combing your hand with the non-dominant hand to make better use of non-dominant hand. I still remember that. So now again coming back to that, as I said earlier, that it is crucial to understand the surgical anatomy and being able to correlate this with endoscopy and radiological finding. Now, if we see in esophagus, it is important to see the endoscopic findings from the point of view of endoscopics, because they will give the distance from the incisor, like the generally we divide the esophagus into cervical esophagus, which is 15 to 80 centimeter. Then thoracic esophagus, which is upper thoracic esophagus, which is 18 to 20, and 24 to 32, and lower thoracic esophagus, which is 31 to 40 centimeter. Now this division is arbitrary, and this depends on the height and gender of the patient. So for a short lady, probably the disease at 24 centimeter, 23 centimeter would be infragranular and would still be suitable for a surgical like esophagectomy. But for a tall gentleman and the disease reported at 26 centimeter from incisor would still be supragranular and may not be suitable for surgery. So this is important. The other thing is, it is important to see the imaging by ourselves, because in many of the situations the radiologist would report the level of the esophagus, the disease in the esophagus, like as per the level of the vertebra, like the disease is extending from T2 to T4 or T2 to T6. But this is not of any relevance to a surgeon who is going to operate the patient. For us, it is important to know whether the disease is supragranular or infragranular, and there are any significant mediastinal nodes. The relationship with aorta is also important. Generally, we say that 90 degree involvement would be suggestive of aortic infiltration in 80% of the cases. But this we have to see once we start seeing many cases, then probably we will understand the importance of this finding. This I have already covered. Now the other important thing is to document the symptoms, how much of degree of dysphagia is there. Now the patient, whether they have dysphagia for solids or semi-solids or for liquid diet, or they have absolute dysphagia. Now this is important. The other thing which is important is to note down the negative history, like recent onset hoarseness of voice, which will signify the involvement of recurrent laryngeal nerve. The other thing is the recent onset chest pain or backache, which will signify locally advanced esophageal cancer. The third thing is recent onset cough with lot of expectoration, because this will signify either involvement of trachea or a possible tracheoesophageal fistula. Knowledge of endoscopy is important. We must ask our endoscopist that what is the distance of the disease from incisor, but more important thing is to note down the distance of the disease from trachopharynx as well as GE junction. The second thing is whether the disease is circumferential or it is non-circumferential. How much of circumference is involved. Now this is a bronchoscopic finding where you can easily see that there is a disease which is infiltrating into the bronchus, and there is a disease where there is a bulge in the posterior wall of the trachea. Now important thing is to ask our the pulmonologist whether the posterior wall of the trachea or bronchus is mobile or not. If suppose it is not mobile or a cough impulse, that means there is involvement of the posterior wall of the trachea. Now adapting MAS is easy in many of the surgical procedures, but when it comes to esophagus, it can be challenging, because doing a minimal invasive esophagectomy requires changing of the position during the surgery. Most of the situation we do the procedure either in prone position or semi-prone position, sometimes in lateral decubitus position. All the positions have their advantages or disadvantages. It is important to lead from the front and understand every small step when we are changing the position. Like it is important to have a good center line before we start the procedure. Flexometallic tube is important when we are doing the procedure, because we need to change the position again and again. The other thing is when we are shifting the position, it is important to be in the theatre and make sure that every step is taken into account. Like both the arms should be by the side of the patient while shifting the patient into the other side. These are the prone position for semi-prone position. Generally, I prefer to do prone position where we put the first port in the just below the level of the scapula. The second, the camera port will come to intercostal spaces below this, and the third working port will be somewhere here. So there are advantages of semi-prone position, like it offers better ergonomics, especially the exposure of posterior mediastinum when we are dissecting the nodes around the left recurrent laryngeal nerve. If there is a requirement for open surgery, this is a better position. And disadvantages are, it requires an extra board. There is a potential for pooling of the blood because of gravity in the surgical field. It will obscure the surgical field and require suctioning again and again. The The third thing is it requires an expert anesthetist to put a double lumen or a trochanteric block to keep the lung collapsed. Now the advantage of prone position is it minimizes lung injury because the lung will be collapsed and it will go down with the gravity, and with the effect of CO2 insufficiency and low tidal volume, the lung will be collapsed. Lymph node harvest is better. The disadvantage is the dissection along the left recurrent laryngeal nerve will be compromised. Now once we start the procedure, see, we can use the long-acting local anesthetic like bupivacaine before we start the procedure into the intercostal space because it has shown to reduce the post-operative requirement for analgesia. My mentor used to say that before we put the first port, it is good practice to use your index finger to make sure that the lung is not adherent to the parietal pleura. Because injury to the lung by use of trocar and port blindly can lead to catastrophic results. So use your index finger, make sure that the lung is not adherent, and then put the first port. And after placing the first port, then this next port can be placed under vision.
Full screen करो.
Yeah, so I'll just go ahead with this. So it is important to put the next subsequent ports under vision, avoiding injury to the intercostal nerve. Generally, in our MS General Surgery training, we were taught that it is a good practice to put the air pass avoid injury to the intercostal nerve. We can use the intracorporeal intercostal nerve blocks also, either during the procedure or towards the end of the procedure. Now the third working port, which is going to be in the lower thorax, we can put it under vision by avoiding injury to the diaphragm. So you can see that the diaphragm is there and the port is coming. This is the diaphragm and the port is coming adjacent to the diaphragm. Now once we start the procedure, under the ICG immunofluorescence, we can identify the thoracic duct which is going adjacent to the aorta. This is the esophagus. So this anatomy is very important. Esophagus, aorta and thoracic duct. In smokers, sometimes we find adhesions of the lung with the parietal pleura. These adhesions can be either divided gently, and my personal preference would be to do it either with some energy device like harmonic ligashio or using a monopolar diathermy, because sometimes these adhesions can be vascular and they will keep on using the blood, making the surgical field difficult to dissolve. Now, once we have assured that the disease is resectable, generally we start the dissection at the level of inferior pulmonary ligament. So this is the inferior pulmonary ligament. It has two layers, so we will dissect layer by layer, trying to avoid injury to the adjacent lung, and we will move upwards towards the right main bronchus, dissecting the mediastinal pleura, taking all the lymph nodes between the esophagus and the lung with the esophagus. The important structure which will come little above from the inferior pulmonary ligament is inferior pulmonary vein, which can be seen under the pericardium. And it will be a good practice to use one of the energy devices, either harmonic scalpel or ligashio. Try avoid using the monopolar cautery in this season. Now the ventral dissection is the dissection anterior to the esophagus. Anatomically, here in prone position, we will see it as posterior dissection. So as we are going up, we will keep on dividing the loose areolar tissue between the esophagus and the pericardium. Here we can see the elevation of inferior pulmonary vein. And once we go above the inferior pulmonary vein, we can see the right vein bronchus. It is important to use the energy devices judiciously to avoid any bleeding in the sensorial field. Now, if there is significant fibrosis, there is a likelihood of getting into a wrong plane. Here we can see that this is the pericardium, which is already lifted because of significant fibrosis. So, with careful dissection, we need to come back to the right plane, which is anterior to the pericardium. So, this is important to identify, especially when the patient has received some kind of neoadjuvant treatment, either chemotherapy or chemoradiation. There is a good likelihood of having such kind of fibrosis. So, it is important to recognize the correct plane to reduce the complications. Now we are dissecting above the level of the pericardium. This is the layer of the pericardium. See, in cases where pericardium is involved, one layer of pericardium can be taken with the en bloc with the disease, but that should be discussed before surgery, that we need to take the one layer of pericardium, or even during the surgery it has to be done deliberately, not by mistake. Now here we can see it is important to identify the vagus nerve. Without dividing the vagus nerve, we cannot take out the specimen of esophagus. But it is also important to preserve the branches of the vagus nerve with the bronchus, because they will reduce the postoperative pulmonary complications. So we need to divide the vagus nerve once they have given the branches to the bronchus. We can see some of the branches here which are coming to the bronchus. Here we can see the reflection of vagus nerve under the mediastinal pleura. Sorry for the trouble. Something is happening. Somewhere here we can see the reflection of vagus nerve, and we need to divide at this level and preserve the branches which are going into the bronchus. The same thing we have to do on the opposite side, that is the left side. So this is the anatomy of both the vagal trunks. This is the right vagal trunk, this is the left vagal trunk, and the branches which are coming to the bronchus. This is the surgeon's view in prone position. When we are dissecting the esophagus in prone position, this is the view which we are going to get, and we need to divide the esophagus at this level on the right side and this level on the left side. This is the trachea, and this is the bifurcation into left and right vein bronchus. Now here we can see that we are going to divide the esophagus just below the branches into the bronchus. We are taking out the subcarinal nodes. The dissection of subcarinal nodes can be tricky because sometimes they can bleed profusely. It is important to use the energy device judiciously close to the bronchus, avoid injury to the bronchus, especially the posterior layer of the bronchus and the trachea, which is the membranous layer and very prone to damage. Now we have started doing the dorsal dissection, that is the dissection between the esophagus and the aorta, that is on the other side of the esophagus, away from the surgeon. So we need to divide the entire mediastinal layer right from the level of azagus vein to the level of inferior pulmonary ligament and lower down. And by putting a gentle traction on the esophagus with one instrument, we can divide the superior part of the, there are some branches which are direct from the aorta to the esophagus. We need to coagulate them carefully to avoid bleeding. Now with ICG fluorescence, we can identify the thoracic duct and safeguard the thoracic duct by dissecting between the thoracic duct and the esophagus. Even if there is a possibility of damage to the thoracic duct or intraoperatively we feel that there is a suspicion of thoracic duct leak, it is a good practice to ligate the thoracic duct in the lower thorax to avoid the complications of post-surgery thoracic duct leak, because that can be catastrophic. And thoracic duct leak cannot be managed by conservative measures. We have to bring the patient back to the surgical theatre and we need to clip the thoracic duct in the lower thorax. So ICG immunofluorescence helps a lot in identifying the thoracic duct and safeguarding it. Now there is a lot of fibrosis between the thoracic duct and esophagus in this video, and we have to carefully dissect the tissue between the thoracic duct and esophagus while avoiding the injury to the thoracic duct. In cases where there is lot of fibrosis and there is obvious involvement of the thoracic duct, it is a good practice to ligate the thoracic duct and take the entire specimen oblong. On the other video you can see there is severe fibrosis and we are taking the thoracic duct and astragalus oblong with the specimen. Put at least 2 clips on the lower side to avoid any thoracic duct leak. So we have already divided the thoracic duct and astragalus. Before we start the procedure, it will be a good thing for the surgeons to learn and operate the ultrasound, that is portable ultrasound investigator, and put 1 ml of ICG immunofluorescence into one of the inguinal node. That will help in identifying the thoracic duct during the procedure. Now the other thing which will possibly reduce the post-operative pulmonary complication is identification and safeguarding of bronchial vessels. The anatomy here is important. Generally, the right bronchial vessel will run immediately anterior to the astragalus vein. That is anatomical anterior. Here we can see it posterior. So it will come from aorta. It's a direct branch from aorta. It will come, involve the circumference of the astragalus vein and then supply the right main bronchus. On the other side, on the left side, we will have so this is the right bronchial vessel. You can see it here. That is the right bronchial vessel. And on the left side, on the left side you can see it here. That is the left bronchial vessel. We need to identify and safeguard both the side bronchial vessels to reduce the pulmonary complications. Now this is a good article written by Dr. C.S. Pramesh, thoracic surgeon at Tata Memorial Hospital, and so it's a good article. Younger surgeons can read it for identification of bronchial duct during transthoracic procedure. Now once we have finished the infra-astragalus part of the procedure, we have to go to supra-astragalus dissection, and the important structure here is recurrent laryngeal nerve. We need to follow the vagus nerve, the right trunk of the vagus nerve, and then we have to identify the right recurrent laryngeal nerve which is going to wind around subclavian artery here in this location. And we can see some small lymph nodes close to the recurrent laryngeal nerve. It is important to avoid using energy devices close to recurrent laryngeal nerve, otherwise it will lead to neuroplexia and significant pulmonary complication after surgery. On the other side, left side, dissection of left recurrent laryngeal nerve is little tricky in prone position. We need to compress the trachea and then only we can find the recurrent laryngeal nerve on the left side. Once we have completed the procedure, it is important to decide carefully between the trachea and esophagus. This is the final procedure where we can see good inflation of trachea and both the bronchus. It will be a good practice to spill some normal saline at this stage and to make sure that there is no leak from the airway. If there is a leak, it is of vital importance to identify it during the procedure and repair it rather than delaying it for later. Again, there is a good learning curve in doing minimal invasive esophageectomy. Generally, we say that 20 to 25 cases are required to become an expert in doing transthoracic esophageectomy by minimal invasive approach. Now, it is of vital importance to identify a good subset of patients with small tumor volumes in the beginning, and gradually, as we gain more confidence, we can go on to operating locally advanced cancer also, because that will boost the confidence to a great extent. Now, I owe my oncology knowledge to Dr. Ravi Kannan, and I had the privilege of working with him for almost 15 years, and working with him has changed my perspective and approach towards the cancer patients to a great extent. He is a Padma Shri recipient in 2020 and Raman Magsaysay Award winner in 2023. And for minimal invasive surgery, I attribute my knowledge to Dr. T.S. Rao, who is the director of surgical oncology in Indo-American Cancer Hospital, and Dr. Shrajan Shukla, who is a dear colleague of me and who helped me with this presentation. For a thoracic surgeon performing the esophageectomy, it is very important to have good friendship with endoscopists, because they will give you the vital importance. Initially, it will be a good practice to do the endoscopy by yourself if your institute is allowed. But if your institute is not allowing to do that, at least you stand by the side of the gastroenterologist and see where the disease is, whether it is circumferential, non-circumferential, how much of distance is from cricofacial and GE junction. Bronchoscopy, the pulmonologist is of vital importance if you are doing the esophageectomy, because sometimes these patients will require a lot of bronchial and pulmonary toileting post-surgery in the ICU. Again, the radiologist, because they will help you in staging the disease as well as in finding out the post-operative complications like pneumonia or if there is a leak in the stomach tube. The physiotherapist, as soon as we diagnose the esophageal cancer, the physiotherapy part should begin there. Even if the patient is going for neoadjuvant chemotherapy or neoadjuvant CTRT, the prehabilitation part, like incentivespirometry, chest physiotherapy, should begin at that level. Then only we can get good outcomes. And of course, the role of intensivist cannot be ignored. Now, nothing gives more pleasure than being able to eat by mouth. And once patients who have undergone treatment for esophageal cancer and they are able to do, they will be grateful to you and your team forever. Thank you. Sorry for a lot of trouble during the presentation.
Sorry for the technical delay of my presentation. So I already presented management of retrosternal goiter in this forum previously. Just recapitulate the few points. And I presented another case where the retrosternal goiter present in the posterior mediastinum. So as you know, the retrosternal goiter is described by the 749 by the Heller, and its various aspects of this entirety has been written, and the actual definition of the retrosternal goiter is not clear. So there are many surgeons consider retrosternal goiter up to the level of the T4 or maybe down to the level of the arch of the aorta. So no exact definition of the retrosternal goiter, but why retrosternal goiter is developed? Because the thyroid gland in the neck is bounded by the anatomical by the different structure, muscles, but lower down there is no boundary, and there is a big space to develop the retrosternal goiter. So usually it's present in the 5th decades, and the symptoms is basically in the form of the compression, and some of the patient, 1/3 patient presented with the dysphasia, and vocal cord palsy presented only in 3 to 5% of the patients. Very few patients presented with the SBC syndrome, Horner syndrome. The best way of this type of the cases, the best investigation is the CT thorax. Usually most of the thyroid patients we operated without the CT scan, and one of the patient I just in my presentation I will show where how we manage without the CT. practical classification. In this practical classification, it's a type A cervicothoracic goiter, pyramidal with the apex pointing down. So this is the usual presentation. Most of the retrosternal goiter is a type A. In type B, basically cervicothoracic goiter, pyramidal with apex pointed up. So it's a pyramidal, and once you, in the cases of the management of the retrosternal goiter, if the suppose retrosternal goiter in the neck and you are in the suprasternal region, and if you are trying to remove this retrosternal goiter, you just put your fingers. If your two fingers going down and both fingers can touch each other, then you can definitely remove this goiter easily. But if suppose your both fingers display like in a pyramidal type of the retrosternal goiter, never go through the neck and neck root, and should go for the median sternotomy. Type C is basically it's a bilobe goiter with a narrow neck or pedicle, and type 4 it's very rare. It's a isolated pulmonary or isolated thoracic nodule. So these are the different 4 types. In type 4, it's definitely you should manage by the sternotomy, but most of the other types can easily manage by the neck root. So there are very few indications of the sternotomy in the type 4, SVC syndrome, isolated retrosternal goiter to the level of the arch on the CT. So usual case, it's a usual case. This is type A type of the case. This is already I presented in previous lecture. And just go through. This is type C, it's a bilobe. This is the bilobe one. This is the posterior nodule. It's a case of the sleep apnea syndrome. Type 4 is again, fourth case is type A. Now this is the case I would like to discuss. It's a case, a 51-year-old female who presented to a toxic multinodular goiter, and when we operated and we found it's a retrosternal goiter, and we did the complete total thyroidectomy, and for dealing of this retrosternal portion, because we did not perform CT scan this patient. At that time I insert 2 fingers and I found my both fingers displaced. So we closed the this specimen at that time this surgery and postponed, and again we investigated on CT scan. You may appreciate it a large intrathoracic component. It's up to the level of the arch of the aorta. So this patient, you can easily appreciate it's a very big intrathoracic goiter. So this patient managed by the median sternotomy later. Now come to the last case. It's a case where the patient is a 54-year male presented with the symptoms of the dyspnea, and on CT scan we found basically it's a large goiter with toxic multinodular goiter, and we found it's a large nodule in the posterior lobe. And this nodule, as per these radiologists, they consider it's a separate nodule. But we know it's a continuity from the thyroid. So thyroid retrosternal goiter in posterior mediastinum is rare, but still 1 to 5% chance are there. So don't think that posterior mediastinum thyroid nodule may not occur. May be possible. So this patient we perform the surgery. First we do total thyroidectomy. So in surgery, this is the left lobe, and right side we found there is a nodule going downwards, and this nodule is behind the common carotid vessels and in brachiocephalic vein and going to the posterior mediastinum. So with the help of the CVT surgeon, we did median sternotomy, and this is the common carotid vessel behind this knee, innominate vein. So this is the nodule posteriorly. This is the post-op X-ray. So finally, the take-home message: definition of retrosternal goiter is not clear. Most of the cases can easily managed by the cervical rope. CT scan is investigation of choice. Most of the time, thyroid patient we usually not advise the CT scan. But clinically, whenever you have to examine the patient, you cannot reach the lower part of the thyroid gland. Definitely, you should advise CT scan on those cases. Proper positioning and meticulous dissection of the key of success. Special attention of the recurrent laryngeal nerve and parathyroid. Thank you.